Certainly good to have the opportunity to speak with you in this lectureship at this time. If you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to be turning to the book of Ecclesiastes. Our verses that we're looking at in there will be from chapter 2 and verses 18 through 25. We'll look at that more closely here in just a few moments. But chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. Before we go into that actual text and talk about what Solomon had to say there, our topic is work, a source of vanity. Most people that are familiar, of course, with the book of Ecclesiastes are familiar with those words, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, vexation of the spirit. And as we read the book of Ecclesiastes, sometimes we come away partly depressed to a certain extent, but then we realize that Solomon wraps up the book in a good fashion at the end. But as we think about the concept of work, to talk about work, I want to go back to the very beginning. And going back to the very beginning, I mean go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, we find there, of course, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had been placed into what is called a place of paradise. What I don't know is how long they were there. Were they there a few days? Were they there years? Were they there a long time? The Bible really doesn't tell us how long they were in the Garden of Eden before they messed up. But they did mess up, and we find that there were consequences because they messed up. In chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, verses 17 through 19, we find these words. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Work. There it begins. Now, I don't know if there was any kind of work at all that they had involved while they were in the Garden of Eden. It was a paradise. I don't know whether they got to take naps. I don't know whether they slept. I don't know what the situation was for them while they were in the Garden of Eden. But they messed up, they're kicked out, and now God says, you're going to work. You're going to sweat while you work. And while you work, you're going to have a lot of trouble. So work has this beginning there, and it kind of comes about as a result of a curse that was placed upon them because of the fact that they had sinned and done what God told them not to do. Well, work is one of those things the Bible has a lot to say about. Sometimes it comes across good, sometimes it comes across a little bad. But as we look at our text today, we're going to look at work, a source of vanity. Now, as Solomon writes in the book of Ecclesiastes, he has a lot to say about the word labor. The word labor and the word work. Now, I didn't go through and count how many times these two words are found in whatever translation you may look at, but he uses the word labor a whole lot. Even beginning in chapter 1 and verse 3, notice he says there, What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? So Solomon kicks off with the idea of labor, and he's going to talk about it a lot all throughout the book. Chapter 1, verse 8, he says, All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. But one of the more interesting verses that's found in chapter 2 is verse 10 and 11. If you look at verses 10 and 11, notice what he says. This is in chapter 2. And whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do. And behold, all was vanity and vexation of the spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. Well, we could go through several verses throughout the book of Ecclesiastes to notice how many times he talks about labor. Now, the verses that I'm about to look at here in a few moments has the word labor in it several times as he talks about work or labor in that particular context. But it's so interesting here what he has to say about under the sun. I want to also back up and take a look for a moment at chapter 1, verse 14. In chapter 1, verse 14, he says, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of the spirit. We find ourselves maybe wondering, why? Why would you say work? It was a curse that God gave a long time ago for the mistakes that Adam and Eve had made. But why is work considered a vanity? Well, as you go through the book of Ecclesiastes, some of the things that surface regarding the idea of work being vanity or vexation, one is that your works, they don't last. They disappear, they fade away. Also, the works, they do not provide enduring happiness. Also, he says of work, they are not appreciated by others. And something else that Solomon will address, he says, they will not be remembered after those who have achieved them have passed on. But what also is so interesting about some of the things he says, and it's in this verse, and we've also saw it back a moment ago with chapter 1, verse 3, is a phrase that's found 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Under the sun. 29 times in these 12 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes, he has that phrase, under the sun. That's important because as we look at some of the things that Solomon has to say, sometimes he says things that we think, wait a minute, I can find a contrary idea toward that somewhere else in the Bible. So Solomon, what are you saying? Well, what we have to do as we study the book of Solomon is to understand the importance of this phrase, under the sun. When he said back in chapter 1, verse 3, he says, what profit hath a man of all his labor which he has done under the sun? So that has an extremely important part all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes because this is everything that is earth-oriented, concentrating on the here and now. And so when we live in this life, we know as Christians, we got to learn how to look beyond the sun. We are looking here in Ecclesiastes, so much of this is under the sun. But as we learn to live for God and live for Jesus Christ, we learn to live, as it were, beyond the sun because we're living for something that is past what goes on here in this life. We live here, yes, but we're living in anticipation of beyond the sun and not under the sun. So as we look at Ecclesiastes, you must realize that focus that he does is he has tried all of these things. He's had all of these things in his hands, at his disposal. And he's tried everything he possibly could. And he realizes all of these things of an earthly nature, he says it's vanity, it's vexation of the spirit. As I was studying this and looking at chapter 2, I was kind of impressed with something, and it just stood out. I would say that Ecclesiastes chapter 2 is the most egotistical chapter in all the Bible. Now, I say that for this reason. In the first 11 verses, the words I, me, my, mine, or myself. Now those words all focusing on, an individual. In the first 11 verses, they're found 44 times in just the first 11 verses. When you read throughout the entire chapter, the words I, me, mine, myself are found 71 times. Now, is that an egotistical problem or what? 71 times in 26 verses. And verse 10 in chapter 2 is one that, maybe I shouldn't use this illustration, but it's kind of like thinking about when, as a child, you do something bad, you do something wrong, and your grandma comes in and she says, my. You did what? In verse 10, my is used 5 times. My. So the egotisticalness of what's found in chapter 2, focusing on self, first focusing on what I have done, what I have accomplished. And that just is there so thoroughly throughout those verses. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at what is actually my text for our lesson this morning. In verses 18 through 23, I want to notice what is found there. In these verses, what we find there is man has failed to figure out how to control his estate. And as we think about that, let's look first of all at verses 18 through 22. So in verses 18 through 22, he says, Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun. There's our under the sun again. Because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall we have rule over all my labor wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. What we see in these few verses right here is man has failed to figure out, and he has this idea, I've done all my work, I've worked hard, I have labored, I did this, I did that, and guess what? I'm going to have to leave it to somebody that's incompetent. You know, sometimes you see in the world today where somebody has worked real hard throughout their life. They've slaved, they've saved, and they've done everything they possibly could to build a business. And in building this business, they've got everything going and flowing real nice and real good. And then they look at their son. Am I going to leave this to him? He hasn't worked very hard. He hasn't done anything but give me trouble. He's just as incompetent as he can be. He doesn't care about this business. I'm going to leave it to him. And so Solomon talks about this, and Solomon has very first-hand knowledge of this particular situation, because you go and you think about what Solomon had done. Solomon was considered to have been one of the best of the kings that was over the nation of Israel. David probably considered the best, but Solomon came along and he did good things. He, of course, built the temple. He worked hard and he was very prosperous. There was not so many wars. There wasn't a lot of battle. You remember David had all the battles during his reign, but Solomon's was one of the most peaceful times in all the reign of the nation of Israel. But he had a son. Solomon had worked hard. He had labored hard. And as Solomon pens these words in the book of Ecclesiastes, he may be thinking about, I've done all this work. I've worked real hard. And there's Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is going to undo this with probably less than a year. It didn't take long. And so shortly after Solomon leaves his reign, he has the peaceful kingdom. He's worked hard. Israel's in good shape, financially and so many other ways. And as soon as he's gone, so also is the kingdom. So when Solomon pens these words, man has trouble about all the labors that he's done, because he thinks about, when I get done, when I leave, I'm going to leave it to somebody that's incompetent. But we'll look at verse 21. In verse 21 we find, for there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity, yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity and great evil. So in verses 18 through 20, he said, I'm going to do all this work, and I'm going to leave it to somebody that's incompetent. And now he says in verse 21, I'm going to do all this work, and guess what? I'm going to leave it to somebody that's an ingrate. They haven't worked. They don't appreciate it. They don't know what it's all about. You know, we have an adage that we often speak about, that we can't take it with us. And the idea of we can't take it with us is a very biblical concept. We can go back and look at Job 1 and verse 21. And in Job 1:21, Job put it in about as succinct terms as you can possibly put it. He said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. Paul comes in and kind of puts it maybe in a little different light, but still saying the same thing. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 7, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. We came with nothing. We'll leave with nothing, basically, is the storyline there. So the riches that you may gain and attain, they're not going with you. Then we look at verse 22 here in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. In verse 22 it says, for what hath man of all his labor and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? He has to leave it in spite of all his hard work. I'm sure most of you are kind of like I am. There are a lot of things I like to do, and I work hard. I work around the place where I live, and I can think through my mind what that used to look like. I can think that used to be covered up with briars and thickets and all kind of brush and everything, and I cleared it out. I chopped it out. I worked hard. I sweated hard, and I can think about those things. One of these days, it'll be gone. I'll be gone. And Solomon says, vanity, vanity of vanities. In spite of all that hard work, what has it done for me? What profit has it been? Well, that can be very kind of, dejecting to a certain extent, kind of take the wind out of your sails when you look at that and think about what you've done. So is it worth anything? Is work worth anything? But then we look at the remaining part of chapter 2. And I want to read verses 24 through 26 because what we have here is a revised thesis. As we look at this, let's look at verses 24 through 26. He said, "There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who else can hasten herein too, more than I? For God giveth to a man that is good in his right wisdom, and knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner he giveth travail, together and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit." There is a major break, really, that takes place in verse 24. What we have in verse 24 is that prior to this verse, God is not mentioned but only one time prior to this verse, and it's in chapter 1, verse 13. You go back to chapter 1, verse 13, the only time God has been mentioned up to this point. And there it says, "And I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the souls of man to be exercised therewith." Now, that doesn't really talk a whole lot about our association or our responsibility before God. It just says this is something God was involved in. So God is mentioned in verse 13, but not a whole lot is said there about what is man's role or place before God. But now, after we come to verse 24, after that point, God becomes a focal point of discussion throughout the remainder part of the book of Ecclesiastes. At first, we see that Solomon has a negative view of wisdom and its worth. You look back in chapter 2 earlier, he makes some statements about wisdom and how that it's vanity and vexation of the spirit. But then after this verse 24, after this, wisdom is shown to be important in life. The author's previous view of various aspects of life, of history, of humanity, it's been very pessimistic up until verse 24. But then at that point, his words acknowledge the value of life. He still will go back and talk about things that are vanity and vexation of the spirit. But in the remaining part, beginning with verse 24, Solomon begins to bring in, let's think about God. Let's see where God fits in this picture. This becomes very important. Now, when you look at verse 24, it says, "There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink." Now you stop right there and you think, okay, Solomon, I kind of like this philosophy. But notice, he did not say what sometimes you hear today in our world, eat, drink, and what? Be merry. Now, that's not what Solomon said. He said eat and drink. But then what did he say after that? He said, "And that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor." What he is beginning to do, and as it points out very clearly then in verse 26, he's beginning to bring God into this picture. So he rather begins to speak of the good things of the earth. There are good things here that we should enjoy, and that we should have happiness in life and joy in life. And man should also be grateful for those things that God has provided for him. Paul, in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 33, was talking about some of the things that he faced in this life. Sometimes he was accused of things that he felt like were not quite up to par. But in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23, Paul said, "All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not." Paul talked about freedom that we have. In the book of Galatians, he talked about the freedom we have in the Lord. So as Christians, we truly have a freedom in this life. If we will stop and think, God created the world, God created us. And when we keep everything in its proper perspective, the earth is ours, isn't it, to a certain extent? God has given us this planet to use, this planet to have good things come from it. So long as we do it in light of understanding what God's place and role is. We consider a passage found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, coming down a little bit further from the one we just looked at in verses 30 and 31, he says there, for if I by grace be a partaker, Why am I evil spoken of for that which I give thanks? Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever you do what? Do all to the glory of God. So there is an underlying theme that lies behind this idea. Under the sun, I said this is a theme that lies throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. When you look at all of these things from the perspective of simply humanity, you look at it simply from just us without God, what is it? It's vanity. It's vexation of the spirit. That's when it's vanity. It's when we do so by looking at it without God. Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. For every creature of God is good, and nothing to be refused, if it be received with thanksgiving. So we see this contrast, and this is often what we must understand about Ecclesiastes. When we look at everything under the sun, it's vanity, vexation of the spirit. But when we bring God into the picture, God has created these things for us. He's made them available for us, and these things are good. James puts it this way in James chapter 1 and verse 17, where James wrote this, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. So can we enjoy life? Yes. So vanity, vexation of the spirit, that's all, quote, under the sun. In other words, just living it for the here and now. But when you bring God into the picture, it changes everything. As he closes out this chapter in verse 26, notice what he says there. He kind of makes a contrast between the good and the bad. In verse 26 he writes, for God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner he giveth travail, together and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of the spirit. The vanity and vexation of the spirit is that aspect for the sinner. The sinner does the work. He may do a lot of good things. You know, there's a phrase, I don't know when this first began, but there's a phrase that created by mankind somewhere along the way when somebody said, good for nothing. Good for nothing. You know, that could be kind of a headline for the book of Ecclesiastes, this idea of vanity and vexation. Good for nothing. As long as you do it under the sun, as long as you do it only as human, as long as you do it without God, you're good for nothing. We know that Jesus himself said that there would be many that would stand before him in the day of judgment, and they would say, Lord, Lord, have we not done this? Have we not done that? Have we not done good things? Did I not go to church? Did I not go to Bible class? Did I not do these things? And God is going to look at him. Jesus is going to look at him. I never knew you. What happened? They were good for nothing. Goodness is not what saves. The Bible makes it very clear that we're not saved by our good works. And very important that we realize that and understand that. In the writing of Proverbs, in Proverbs 11 and verse 18, the Bible we find, the wicked worketh a deceitful work, but to him that soweth righteousness shall be a sure reward. I like the passage in Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. So we know that what we sow, what's going to come back. What's so important is what kind of soil we allow that seed to be sown in. Jesus talked about the sower that went forth to sow. Where did the seed fall? On different kinds of ground. But what's important for us is to make sure that we allow our life to be the kind of ground that seed can find a solid root and be able to grow and mature. So the concept and the idea of work is presented in the book of Ecclesiastes. Is work a vanity and vexation of the spirit? It is when it is, quote, under the sun. Because that's when it's focused only on the here and now. But work can be very important, very valuable. I want to pull a verse out of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6. Talks about work in that passage there. A very important concept of work. Nehemiah had gone back to help rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. Along with Ezra and Nehemiah, they got the temple rebuilt, they got the walls rebuilt, and all this was brought about, as Nehemiah says in Nehemiah 4 and verse 6. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. And then this very, very important phrase that Nehemiah puts there, many of you may have read this, thought about this, studied about it. Preachers may have preached about it from time to time when Nehemiah says, for the people had a mind to work. So we know that work is important when it is work that's directed toward and guided under what God wants us to do. One last passage I would like for us to consider on this idea and concept of work, and that is one found in Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 9. For by grace are you saved through faith, and not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. And then in verse 9 he very simply says, not of works, lest any man should boast. You know, within the churches of Christ, we're often accused of being those that claim that we are saved by works because we talk about the need for baptism, and so baptism is thought of as being a work. But those of us who study the Bible know and realize and understand faith is also said in the Word of God to be a work. Faith is a work. So what we're looking at here, and this Solomon was dealing with in Ecclesiastes, and that is the idea there are different kind of works. There are the works, quote, under the sun, and there are the works, quote, of God. And the works of God, they are also classified in the Bible as works of righteousness. So there is a balance that must be understood, that must be realized as we think about it. So work. Can work be a source of vanity? Work is a source of vanity when it's done under the sun. But work becomes a wonderful and glorious thing when we have a mind to work and do the works of Almighty God. Thank you very much.